and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I am your host, Madison, and today we will be looking at the history of presidential debates. We put a lot of stake into presidential debates, but what if I told you that they were only recently regulated, that we really only started using them as we do in 1988? We had already passed the bicentennial celebration of the United States before presidential debates were regulated. Presidential debates as we know them today began with the Nixon-Kennedy debate in 1960, but it would still take almost 30 years before they were performed in any type of regularity. But what about the first debate? When did that happen? If you listened to my episode about George Washington, you might remember that Washington was elected unanimously both times with no competition. So it wouldn't be until later presidents that we would get a taste of a presidential debate. When Abraham Lincoln was in the running for an Illinois Senate seat, he, along with Stephen Douglas, his opponent, had a series of 7 senatorial debates in 1858. These debates first began as Lincoln following Douglas on the campaign trail and hosting a speech after Douglas. Eventually, Douglas and Lincoln would share the same stage on 7 separate occasions, for 3 hours at a time. There were no moderators, and the debates all seemed to surround the debate around the moral and economic issues that were posed by slavery. Lincoln would not follow in his own footsteps when he ran for president, and it wouldn't be until 1948, 90 years and 15 election cycles later, that there would be an inkling of interest in a debate. In the presidential elections before debating became popular, all campaigning happened separately, and all communication was kept primarily to campaign speeches. In 1948, we had another debate, not between the 2 presidential candidates, but with the 2 Republican primary contenders, Thomas Dewey and Harold Stassen. This debate would be broadcast on the radio to 40 to 80 million listeners. This debate was also largely focused on outlawing communism in the United States. The next election cycle had a televised debate hosted by the League of Women Voters in which all the presidential candidates attended. Still, the debate did not catch on. It was not until the Kennedy-Nixon debate that was both televised and radio broadcast in 1960 that the presidential debate found its footing in the modern election cycle. The 1964 and 1968 election cycles both avoided a presidential debate, with Nixon and Johnson both turning down requests to debate. Nixon, upon being elected, actually used his powers as the president to veto a bill that would override the equal time provisions of the Communication Acts of 1934. The Communication Act of 1934 essentially stated that candidates in national elections would have to be granted the same amount of exposure in media. If one station permitted its use to one candidate, all candidates would have to be offered the same. This provision could be used strategically by candidates. If you refused to debate, yes, you could get some bad press for the refusal, but if you were running against someone who you knew would have a better public-facing persona than yourself, you would avoid that kind of bad press. The public might not necessarily remember your refusal, but they most definitely will remember your poor debate performance. This is exactly why Nixon had vetoed this repeal. In the 1960 presidential debates, Nixon's presidential hopes and dreams were squandered by a poor debate presence. Depending on who you asked at the time, there was a mixed review on who won the Kennedy-Nixon debates. If you listened to the radio broadcast, you probably would have said Nixon. But if you watched the televised broadcast, you probably would have said Kennedy. At the time of the 1960 debate, John F. Kennedy was the Democratic nominee and Richard Nixon was the Republican nominee. Before the debate, the Nixon ticket was ahead by 6 points. This debate was restricted to questions about internal or domestic American matters. The format would include 8-minute opening statements, 2.5-minute responses to questions, an optional rebuttal, and 3-minute closing statements. Nixon had refused to wear makeup for the first debate, which only highlighted his facial stubble. He also chose to wear a light gray suit, which was soon soaked with sweat as the studio lights were hot. Kennedy, on the other hand, wore a dark suit, accepted the offer for makeup, and overall took to the screen more naturally than Nixon. He was a photogenic, handsome young senator from Massachusetts. Kennedy had also been recently debating while on the Democratic primary run, so he was more practiced than Nixon. Nixon had been vice president to Dwight Eisenhower for 8 years at this point. Nixon had also recently been hospitalized for a knee injury that he had aggravated again upon entering the debate, contributing to his sickly appearance. This first debate was watched live by 70 million people. There were 3 more debates that followed this first one, but each was watched by 20 million fewer people. By 1975, the FCC had created a loophole as a way to avoid the equal time provisions. It said that as long as the debates were considered bona fide news events that were sponsored by an organization, that these events would be exempt from the equal time requirements. The League of Women Voters swooped in and took the reins on the political campaign machine. The League of Women Voters would conduct the presidential debates for the next 8 years. In 1988, the Commission on Presidential Debates took over, and now any presidential debate that happens under this commission. Any debate before the official presidential debate can be hosted by news agencies and television networks. In 1976, the debates between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter were what set the groundwork for the presidential debates as a staple in the American political environment. They were also the debates that lost Ford his chance to actually be elected as president. During the debate, Ford had said that there was no Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, when there definitely was, in fact, Soviet domination as we were in the middle of the Cold War. This statement is seen as one of the leading reasons for why Ford had lost the election and Carter won. The following election, the debates between Reagan and Carter really cemented the presidential debate as standard in the political season. Now that we have arrived at the modern day presidential debates, how do they work in the modern era? Now that they are an expected part of each election cycle. The Commission of the Presidential Debate has set up that the threshold to be included in the presidential debate as 15%. So anyone who is running for president needs to hold a 15% polling average to even be considered. This is why we have typically only seen two debaters, the Republican and Democratic nominee. This threshold was also what the League of Women Voters had used when they were the ones in charge. The one-offs or third-party candidates that made it to the debates include George Wallace in 1968, John Anderson in 1980, and Ross Perot in 1992. The polling measure is determined by the Gallup poll and not the commission itself. When the commission first started conducting debates, there was one moderator with a panel of 3 journalists. By 1992, the commission had introduced a town meeting where citizens who had been selected by the Gallup organization as undecided voters would ask each candidate questions. In the 3 most recent elections, not counting the current 2024 election, the commission has conducted debates in this format. The debate would be split up into 6 15-minute-long segments where the candidates would discuss one major issue facing the nation. The topic of the debates was announced several weeks beforehand to allow the candidates time to prepare. All of this structure is designed to allow for meaningful conversation to be had while also staying within the time constraint. Moderators are chosen weeks in advance by the commission with the use of 3 criteria. The first is familiarity with the candidates and major issues of the presidential campaign. The second being extensive experience in live television broadcast news, as well as an understanding that the debate should be focused on maximum time and attention on the candidates and their views. The moderator is also the one who selects the questions to be asked. This is not known beforehand and is completely up to the moderator. The debates are still one of the most wide-reaching ways in which presidential candidates can reach voters, both those that have already decided, but more importantly, those that still remain undecided. For example, in the 2020 election, the debate was viewed by 73.1 million viewers, and that number does not include international views or views from streaming platforms. Ever since the Nixon-Kennedy debates, all debates have been held in September or October. The most recent debate between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump in June was the earliest a debate had been held in over 60 years. Even though the debates seem to be standard fare, they are not required. It is not mandatory for either candidate to commit to a debate. But now, after having years and many election cycles in which the debate is expected and considered important, it would not look good for the candidate who denies an invitation. Long gone are the days in which you could use denying an invitation to a debate to your advantage. Second to maybe only the Super Bowl, the presidential debates are one of the most watched public broadcasts in the nation. I hope you can leave today's episode saying you learned something new about the history of the presidential debates. Today's sources include howstuffworks.com, the Constitution Center, Pew Research Center, Time Magazine, and Wikipedia. If you would like to email me any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at itsahistorypodcast, and I'm also on Threads. Thank you for listening. I hope to have you in next week's episode.